Hello and welcome to our webcast. Moss Adams is pleased that you joined us for today's webcast, Composition, Recruitment, and Succession Planning for Boards. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And now I would like to introduce today's presenters, Annie Rose Favreau and LeeAnn Stivers, both senior managers here at Moss Adams. Their bios and contact information are located in your console if you would like more information. Now, I would like to turn the floor over to the presenters to provide a snapshot of their professional background. Annie Rose, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone who has joined us today. We are so pleased that you're here. I'm a director with the Strategy and Operations Consulting team. I use she, her pronouns, and I specialize in governance, so doing board facilitation work, board development, as well as organizational assessments and strategic planning for nonprofit and public sector organizations. So I get to spend a lot of different time with leadership teams figuring out sort of how do we get where we are today to where we want to be going. And I'm really looking forward to sharing a little bit more with you all. LeeAnn?
Hi, everyone. My name is LeeAnn Stivers. I'm a senior manager. I also use she, her pronouns. I'm actually in the Human Capital Advisory team. I specialize in transformation work. I also work with Annie Rose, supporting working with leadership teams in transformation efforts. I specialize in change management, but also spent a long time in nonprofit management. And I'm so excited to spend today talking about the exciting presentation we have on board composition. So I'll turn it back over to Annie Rose.
Fantastic. Well, before we get fully into today's session, I did want to highlight that this is the second part of a 5-part series that we have here that's all focused around how can we be looking at your board, your governing body, and making sure that it's functioning as effectively as it possibly can be functioning. So we had a previous session on roles and responsibilities that I was with my colleague Colleen on that one. That's available to stream online. Today, obviously, we're going to be focusing on composition, recruitment, and succession planning. And coming up, we have a session in September where our colleagues Maria and Kinman are going to be thinking about how to create inclusive boards and committees. That's going to be, I think, a really interesting session. Both of them are very deep into that work. And then in October, we have one on creating effective finance, investment, and audit committees. And that's going to be presented by our colleagues, Tammy, Chelsea, and Anita. And I think that these committees, these can kind of be either often overlooked committees or committees where maybe your finance committee, a ton of really excellent work gets done there, but then you have this question of what is this relationship to the rest of the board? So I think that that will be a really interesting session if you have any of those committees, if you're thinking about developing those committees moving forward. And then finally in December, we are coming back around. We're going to have a panel with various leaders from mission-driven organizations, bringing 5 different leaders together for this panel where they're going to share more about how they're incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion practices into their board work, what that has resulted in, some of their challenges, some of their successes in that area. So I think they're going to be sharing a lot of excellent real-world examples in that one. So we invite you to join us for any or all of those sessions coming up. In terms of what we are focusing on today, we are going to be thinking about board composition. How do we actually make up a board? What is the size? What is the diversity within this group? What are the skills we need? So thinking about kind of all aspects and considerations to ensure that your board composition is set up so that you can have really effective governance. We're also going to be thinking about the board recruitment process and sharing some best practices there, thinking about how you can identify gaps, how you can develop your board recruitment strategy to make this effective work. We know that board recruitment can be really challenging for a lot of organizations, so hopefully there'll be some good takeaways for you all in that section. And then finally, board succession planning. When we think about how are we preparing for the future, how are we preparing to have transitions of key board members, succession planning comes into play. So we're going to be debunking some myths in that section, as well as providing some tools for you all there. And with that, I think we are on to our very first polling question, because we wanted to learn a little bit more about who all has joined us today. So Danielle, do you want to open up that poll?
Absolutely. As Annie Rose mentioned, this is our first of 4 polls. What is your role in your organization? A, board member, B, committee member, C, CEO, executive director, D, management, E, staff, F, other, not applicable. So we'll give you a few moments to respond. A reminder to respond, please click the button next to the answer you choose, and don't forget to hit that submit button towards the bottom. If you cannot see the button, please enlarge your slide area. We'll give everybody just a few more moments here. And the results.
Fantastic. So it looks like we have a good number in the management and staff realm. I'm imagining you're here because you're doing board support work, as well as a good chunk of board and committee members too. LeeAnn, I'm curious, is this lining up with who you thought we'd probably have in the room today?
I figured as much. It's good. It's great that we're going to be going through some of the essentials of board composition. I think it will be informative. So I think where we've got the presentation going will be really helpful, especially in that management sphere. And then also really helpful, especially for those board members on there when thinking about recruitment engagement and participating in that. So yeah, this is great. It's exciting. Happy to have you all here today. Okay. Well, let's talk about board composition. Let's get into it. I think we've got some really interesting information in here. Hopefully it's informative to many of you. It might be a refresher for some of you. So let's jump into it. So for many of you, this might, like I said, be a refresher, but really at the baseline, when we talk about board composition, this is referring to, the organization's board of directors and the team and how they come together. So this is their background, their skills, their experience. This is how they come together as a group and what the board of director team is made up of. So when we use that term board composition, this is really what we're referring to. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So when we think about board composition, this varies wildly depending on the type of board that you might be operating in. Advisory, it could be operational, but there are kind of our three core board composition elements that we like to break it down to, because we feel like this is anchored in all composition elements. So we think about the size, we think about the experience, and we think about the diversity. And when we think about the size, when we're referencing that, we're really thinking about the board should have enough directors to supervise the various committees, subcommittees, to really manage the governance of the organization and have that advisory role within the organization. So depending on what that looks like for your organization, that could vary, large, medium, or small, but really you want to make sure that you have enough to support that advisory role in that governance function. And then we're going to talk a little bit about experience. So when we talk about experience, we want to make sure the board should have, really passion for the organization. So that's talking about, the mission and sufficient experience in maybe financing or fundraising, management operations, programming, depending on what your organization's mission is and vision and focus. We want to make sure that those skills and experiencing are matching to your organization's foundations. So when we think about those board elements, that's where that experience is really living in that area. And then when we talk about diversity, we're talking about the board really should have a range of diverse backgrounds. So that's including professional background, demographics, race, age, other factors. So you really want to make sure that they're providing perspectives on skills that they're bringing into the board to make sure that that's aligning with your mission, vision, and goals for the organization. So those are kind of the core elements when we talk about the composition makeup that we're going to be referring to. We're going to dive into these a little bit more within this presentation. So let's talk a little bit about board size. So size, like I said, it varies depending on, your organization goals, where you're at. Maybe you are a newer organization and you're growing. Minimum in most states, minimum size of a board is typically a minimum of 3. But there are pros and cons to having a smaller board versus a larger board. So let's talk a little bit about that as you're thinking about your board size and scale. So on the smaller side, some of those pros, we think about communication's easier, right? Less people to wrangle, you can talk with them and make sure communication is just easier, kind of wrangling in a group. Board members can get to know each other as individuals. It's just easier to connect at that level. Satisfaction from service can be greater due to constant and meaningful involvement. They're just involved, maybe with their interactions being more frequent. And every person's participation counts. When you're in a smaller team environment, they're really giving and contributing at a great level. Some of those cons in that area at the smaller size, that heavy workload can create burnout, which can create some retention issues at the smaller level. So those are some considerations when you're thinking about that board composition size, just to consider. Then we go on the flip side of that. You think about those larger boards, obviously the pros of that, the larger side, you got a lot of people to help. There's a lot of contributions to the workload across the team. Fundraising, when we think about that within teams, becomes less of a burden when you can distribute that workload across the group. And there's more perspectives of representation. You've got a lot of subject matter expertise when you have a lot of contributions coming across that board. Some of the cons in this group, bigger boards may not be able to engage every board member in a meaningful way. Meetings sometimes are difficult to schedule and manage. If you've been a part of that scheduling group, you know what I mean. There is a danger of loss of individual accountability, and that can become challenging. So when you're thinking about the size of these two groups, small versus large, obviously There's value, pros and cons in all of these areas. But the truth of the matter is, there's no right size. There is really, you really have to think about what's right for your organization and where you're at on your journey. The right size, there's been a recent survey from the board source. The average board size is typically about 16, if you want an average number. But optimal board size really depends on your board's life cycle, where you're at in your mission development, your fundraising necessities, and your goals on where you're at. So this is really complex based on the needs of your organization, but helps you give you an idea of how it lays out and the size variability. Then we have experience and expertise, of course. This kind of gives a layout of all the different components that go into what's needed when you think about it's a team of experience that's needed across the board. So obviously the pie chart piece that's pulled out here is you want to make sure that your team members within the board have a strong sense of mission and purpose for the organization. That's really important. And then there's several other pieces of the pie here: financial acumen, fundraising experience, program operations, human resources, legal. Maybe there's a personal experience or connection. Maybe they've lived in your program, they've done those operations. Maybe they volunteered in it. Maybe they just have a deep connection to the operations. Maybe they were a staff member at one point and they want to level up and become a board member. What's important to note is that they don't have to have all of these slices of the pie. They just need to have components of it. Maybe an individual board member has strong sense of mission driven, they have a personal experience, and maybe they have a little bit of a human resource background. Maybe another board member has strong sense of fundraising experience and a strong financial acumen, and they're really dedicated to the mission. What's important to think about in this is that you're building a team. You want to make sure that your board composition covers the full pie chart of all of this, and that all of your members are covering this circle, and that it's comprehensive to all of these pie slices. But the individuals itself don't need to have all of these skills. It's a makeup of the skills across your group and your team that help make your board composition wholesome and collective. Then we have the diversity piece. Of course, this is a very general term. There's many components of diversity that come into board composition. So what does this mean? There's obviously professional background. So really thinking about subject matter expertise that is going to be needed within your team, especially professional subject matter expertise, demographics, race, age, gender. Do you have a representation goal within your board? Really thinking about what that looks like. Community representation. Maybe, I worked for an organization for a long time and we covered 17 counties across Western Washington. So it was really important for us to make sure that we had cross-representation across multiple counties. So really thinking about when you're thinking about community representation and how you're serving, what does that look like? Skills, are there specific skill sets that you need within your board? Technology, in today's digital world, this is an important one, making sure that you have this covered, as this can become a very expensive skill set within your organization, especially thinking about infrastructure or if there's going to be operations or programming needs in this area. So making sure that you have this subject matter expertise support. Thinking about your board's network and partnerships and where that lives within your board of directors. And then strategy experience, which this one is often overlooked, but I think is a really important one, especially being able to think big picture, especially if you are in an advisory board. So not getting into the weeds all the time of the operations and being able to pull yourself up, be forward thinking, and being able to stay in that strategy sphere. So these are just some of the components that make up that diversity piece when thinking about full composition of the diversity component. And then this is an example of a board composition matrix. This can be obviously very easily moved into an Excel format or something. Annie Rose and I wanted to give you a great tool to be able to walk away with, but this could be used at, in one of your meetings. But what you can do here, as you can see, is you can map out your board team and put their names in here and think about your board team, your expertise, your attributes, and your competencies. Now, we've listed some in here based on the things that we've pulled forward that I've just talked about: experience, fundraising experience, geographic area, gender, commitment to mission, strategic thinking. But really think about what's core to your mission, what's important to your organization, and think through these areas, and you could map out a pretty easy spreadsheet. And then ask your board members to fill this out and think about where their expertise lives. And this is a great way for you to pretty easily be able to think about where your composition and expertise lives, and also be able to identify, do you have any gaps? And really thinking about what it looks like in your coverage areas, and thinking about the overview of all of those attributes that we just talked about across your board, matrix and composition. So I'm going to pass it over to Annie Rose.
Fantastic. So we wanted to share a couple examples with you all of some of these tools that in action that we're talking about, or sort of other boards that have handled challenges in these different areas. And the first case study we wanted to bring up, this was a group I was working with, mid-sized nonprofit. They had a lot of very long-time board members. So folks who had been there for many, many, many years, had deep connections to the organization, but they had just introduced term limits. And this was seen as a positive thing. There was no issue with that. But what it meant was that there was going to be a necessity to be bringing on new members. And this was an exciting time. It also created a lot of uncertainty. People had questions about how are we going about this, and is our composition actually set up in the right way moving forward. In particular, they had been going through, they just completed their strategic planning process. They had some new initiatives on the horizon that were coming up, and they realized that some of these new initiatives, they might need different skill sets on the board than they currently had. But the board was kind of at a loss. They'd been having some conversations about this, but they were all very kind of vague and high level and theoretical. And so the question was like, how do we actually move forward with this? Well, how can we give them a more clear path? So we worked with the board. We used that same composition matrix that LeeAnn just shared. We worked with the board to map the attributes and skills of the group. And within that, we kind of listed out what have been the historic things, the historic areas of expertise that we needed. And also we looked at their strategic plan and said, what are going to be those additional skill sets or additional competencies, relationships, any of those pieces that we'll want to have on our board in order to be able to move the organization forward towards its vision and mission here. So we mapped it all out with them, and it became really apparent very quickly where the gap areas were. There were a couple really key areas where they had either no one currently in that role, or that they knew folks were going to be rolling off of the board within the next year. And as a tool, it helped the board focus on what do we need to be looking at for recruitment, which we're going to talk about in the next section. So what do we need to be doing looking forward? But it also really helped them align around, these are the most critical skills that we need here. These are the most critical gaps that we need to fill, and gave them a much more clear sense of this is where we're heading as a group. It also really helped them figure out how many additional positions might we need to add, because that was another kind of question that kept coming up. We think that we need to add some roles, but really how many? And understanding, okay, we have gaps in these 3 areas. I think that they ended up adding 2 additional roles under the with the goal of being able to recruit and fill in all of those gaps with 2 new positions, as well as with some of the openings that were currently coming up just due to turnover. So I think that that's a good example of, it's a simple tool, but it can really help, especially if you are in that management position, you are kind of working upward with your board. It can be a really helpful way of saying, how are we going to focus this conversation so that it doesn't feel like we're going to go down every single rabbit hole we could here, because as LeeAnn said, there's no single answer to board composition, but we want to be able to say what's going to be right for us today. And I was really impressed by how this board went about this work. All right, and I think with that, we have our second polling question for you, which is a bit of an information check. So Danielle, do you want to take it away on that poll?
Absolutely. Here we are at poll number 2. Which of the following is a key consideration for board composition to ensure effective stakeholder representation? A, diversity, B, experience, C, expertise, D, all of the above, E, I'm not sure. Polling questions are showing up directly in the slides, so if you have minimized those, please take a look at the bottom of your screen. There is a widget for slides. If you open that back up, you should be able to see the slides. And a reminder to please click the button next to your answer you choose and then hit that submit. If you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of our 4 polling questions. Wonderful, and we will move this on to the results.
Excellent. It's looking like there are very few incorrect answers here, because diversity, experience, and expertise are in fact all very important. So thank you for everyone doing those touch points as we make our way through this work as well. All right, LeeAnn, back over to you to take us to board recruiting.
Thanks. Great. All right, we're going to spend some time talking about board recruitment. This may be loved by some, this may not be loved by some. So let's talk about ways to make this a little bit easier, or at least give you some guiding steps to maybe take away the stress of board recruitment if this is something that you have been tasked with. So we thought it would be helpful to put forward kind of just an easy recruitment, 10-step recruitment plan, because I feel like recruitment can also just feel daunting, I think, at some points, especially if you're on maybe a smaller board and you may have the weight of the world on your back. So let's go through some steps to just simplify it and think through how we can help you out with these steps. So hopefully in our first section, we talked about determining your organization's needs and priorities. That matrix is a great way to think about what are your needs across your organization. Utilizing that tool and going through that exercise with your board, thinking about where that analysis work could be needed is a great exercise to have to understand what are the needs and the priorities. Set goals for potential candidates, internal or external. Maybe you have some opportunities within your current board to elevate into positions. Maybe you do need to go external. So thinking about that goal setting process. Obviously, review any bylaws or legal procedures that you need to do within your organization. You want to make sure you're following all of that. And then assign responsibility for recruiting to an assigned or special committee. Now, we understand for smaller boards, this might not be possible, but if you are in a position to have a recruiting committee take this on, we really, really recommend it. Pulling this outside of your board and having assigned responsibility for this within a subset committee or task force is highly recommended. And so we really encourage the following steps from 4 to 10 to be managed within this subcommittee. And it can be brought back to the larger board or to your board chair and executive director, CEO, but it really helps move and keep the momentum with a smaller task sub-team or committee. And so just want to put that forward. Develop recruitment materials for open positions. That could be as simple as the job description. And then this one is a really great one. Develop talking points for board members and or staff for recruitment efforts. So getting the word out there and making it easy for people to get the word out there. That might be LinkedIn posts, that might just be a simple email, but letting people know that you're recruiting for those positions and giving them simple bulleted talking points to talk about the roles that you're looking for really helps simplify and make the recruitment efforts easier. When you make things easier for people, it just allows them to make that step just one step easier for them. Generate a list of potential candidates and prioritize them with your committee. Establish follow-up procedures for committee members as far as your selection criteria. Assign responsibility for contact procedures for best prospects and your screening procedures, and then contact select board candidates for next steps. So again, sounds very simple, but really thinking through those easy steps. Don't overthink it, because this can get there. But again, thinking through what that committee or task force could look like, and thinking through these 10 easy steps can help simplify the process a bit. We also want to talk through what each of these recruitment steps looks like all the way through the process, and making sure that that is equitable, and ensuring that the board reflects the diversity of the community it serves and has the necessary expertise to address future challenges of the organization. So we're going to talk through some of these. We want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to identify board goals and gaps, which we've talked about a little bit. Recruiting considerations. We want to talk through identifying candidates, engaging those candidates, and then also evaluating the candidates. So what we want to go through each of those and some options in there to help guide you through that process. So obviously the board matrix gives you a little bit in terms of your assessment in terms of skill sets. But we wanted to give you also some guiding questions to think through, to dive in a little bit deeper. So here's some additional board recruitment assessment questions for you to consider. What skills or expertise are needed on the board to effectively govern the organization? What diversity of perspectives, experiences, backgrounds, which we've talked about a lot, are needed? What gaps exist in board composition, which we've addressed? How can the board ensure that it reflects the diversity of the community it serves? How can the board ensure that it has the necessary expertise facing future challenges of the organization? So I want to talk about this one a little bit because it also goes with number 7. So I think what's a really important factor here is if your organization is thinking about future work, or if you're going into a strategic planning process, how can you think about aligning your recruitment needs with the future state of the organization? So thinking about what are the needs of the organization in 3 to 5 years. A great example of this is I worked for a board that was going to be doing infrastructure and building of locations. It was going to be expanding to multiple locations, but they had no real estate representation on the board. And that was definitely going to be a recruitment need that they needed to bring in. And so that was a great example of aligning strategic goals and vision planning to board recruitment and assessment needs. So thinking that through in terms of how you're going to align those vision and assessment needs on how you're going to plan for your recruitment vision planning for the future. So that kind of aligns to 5 and 7. And of course, how can the board ensure that it has a mix of long-term and new members to provide continuity and fresh perspectives? So also thinking about your board terms, what does that look like? How long people have been on? And do you want new and fresh perspectives coming in? And what does that look like? So that's kind of a little guide to board recruitment assessment to help guide you there with some guiding questions. And again, we're coming back to that recruitment matrix because it's so helpful. But plug this in for your recruitment assessment or for your recruitment needs, and plug those candidates into this so that you have your matrix built out for your board composition. But as you're bringing in those new candidates, plug them in here so that you can see how they're aligning with your expertise, attributes, and competencies. And so that you can make sure that you're covering those areas that you need across your board and ensuring that you're aligning. And then that pie chart that we talked about is covering all of those areas of your needs across your board, because you really want to make sure that you've got full alignment for current and future state goals. And then the last piece in here that I will cover, and then I'll pass it over to Annie Rose, is really around finding board members. We wanted to offer some tips and tricks in here that we found to be helpful. So obviously, I think the best is leveraging existing board members and their networks. That is always the most helpful tool. Word of mouth and experience sitting on the board. Those are like the gems that are out there for the board members that are on there. You are key and critical to that process, especially if you've had a wonderful experience on there. So that's definitely a great recruitment tool. Utilizing board committees is another way to recruit within their networks. We've listed some local resources in here as well. So Council of Foundations, State Association of Nonprofits, United Way, Community Foundation, nonprofit capacity, building organizations. So those are all just some local resources for you to reference. And then there's more formal ways to go about it. There are search firms that you can look at that would be local to your organization, and recruitment websites that you can look into that could be helpful for finding and customizing to your board needs. And I will go ahead and pass it over to Annie Rose.
Fantastic. So I wanted to talk a bit about engaging candidates, because really when we're thinking about the communication, the process that they might be going through if they are applying to your board, this is their first experience of working with you potentially. So we want to make sure that there's really good back and forth, two-way communication here. I think it's really easy when we think about engaging candidates to think about what are we asking from them, but we also want to highlight that this is a two-way street here too. So in terms of when you are asking questions, I think that the previous list of questions that LeeAnn went over actually is a really great space to start thinking about which pieces of this do we want to bring into the questions that we might ask as part of an interview of these candidates as well. So the two that I have listed here first are ones that I would say we pretty much always see folks asking about as part of information gathering or interviewing with a potential candidate, wanting to understand, do you have experience working on boards or in other governance roles? And even if that's not going to be, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't have experience, you can't serve on the board, obviously, but it just helps, especially for the staff members who are in the position of supporting the board. It's really helpful to understand who has background, who's going to be already familiar with serving on a board and what those structures might look like. A lot of times people end up on boards because they're really incredible managers or leaders within their own organization, and they're really used to functioning in that very operational way of getting in the weeds, getting their hands dirty, wanting to kind of get into the mix of it. And boards ideally are operating at a more strategic kind of policy governance level. And so making that transition can be a little bit difficult for folks sometimes. So it's helpful to understand where you're coming from, what experience might you already have in this space. And also experience working collaboratively. I like to say boards are a team sport. You're always going to be working within a group, whether you're on the board, whether you're within a committee. So understanding their experience of being able to be effective within a group of people where you might have very different ideas a lot of the time. That can be a strength of your board too. But asking about their experience in those types of team settings can be very helpful. And then obviously any questions that are related to the evaluation criteria that you would set at the beginning of the board recruitment in terms of specific skill sets that you might be looking for. But I think potentially the more interesting side of this slide is the share side, because I think we forget to do some of these elements sometimes, which is we really want to be setting expectations right up front and helping people understand what would actually be required of you in this role. So as they're evaluating whether or not they want to join your board, they have all of the information there. So having formal job descriptions, roles and responsibilities, that can be very effective. And I would say that can also cover both some of the high level pieces in terms of, we're going to expect you to engage in these decision-making processes, form policy for the organization, those types of things, but also really specifically, like, we want you in this many meetings per year. This is when those meetings are held. This is whether they are virtual or in person. Those specifics can be incredibly useful right up front in this process to make sure that everybody is really well aligned. And then I think this is another point LeeAnn mentioned earlier, the idea of creating some talking points about the board recruitment process. This can be kind of an extension of that too, of building out some general talking points that can be shared with all candidates around what is the culture of your board? What are your decision-making processes, your mission, vision, values, some of the things that really kind of set the tone for how your board works together. Again, this can feel a little bit like, ooh, this might not be information that they want at this point in time, but I really think giving a snapshot right up front, again, will just help people align and make sure that it's going to be a really good fit from both directions. So thinking about what information do I need to give this person so they can also make a really good choice to opt in or opt out of this opportunity. The other thing that we think about, especially when we're evaluating candidates, is how do we make sure that this process is going to be fair, objective, and consistent? And so I don't have this up on the slide, but this can be a moment to review and potentially revise your nomination and selection process. It's a really good moment to kind of take a step back and say, what does our process look like? You might have a very formal process that is dictated in your bylaws, or some element of this may be dictated for you. But looking at that process and thinking about how can we at any moment that we can address bias throughout this piece. And I've seen a lot of groups that I've working with are starting to introduce practices like blind selection. And I think that can be a really great one here, or committee-based selection, where you might do the initial rounds and then bring some high-level candidates to the full board. Those can be really helpful, just again, to make sure that when we're thinking about how are we accounting for our unconscious bias as part of this process. So adding that in there as a plug. But regardless of the specific structure, I have highlighted here a couple different things that can bring a little bit more value to this process. So the very first thing is, when we're thinking about how are we evaluating candidates, we need to know, especially if you have a recruitment committee that is doing this work, what are our objectives for this recruitment? How are we going to measure that? How are we going to know if we've been successful in this area or not? Another one is group discussion. So a lot of times we'll do a lot of this work at that recruitment committee level, but then we might bring forward a summary or highlights of candidates to the full board so that there can be an open discussion around this. I think this can be a really beneficial thing to bring in and have a full group conversation there, because it allows any concerns to be addressed right up front, and for different board members to hear from each other as well. So you're not just announcing, great, the recruitment committee found somebody and here they are. This is making sure, again, that we have full buy-in to that process. We sometimes recommend self-assessment tools for candidates who are coming in. This can be a nice way, especially if you're looking for candidates who might have more non-traditional backgrounds, or you have less experience in whatever their background is, to have them be able to share more, okay, this is where I'm coming from, this is what I see my skill set as being. This can be a really great way, especially again, if you have a real range of the diversity of candidates that you're bringing in, having everyone take that self-assessment tool can be a nice addition to this process. And then finally, references. Not all boards do this, but especially if you're bringing in new candidates, if you're bringing in a substantial kind of group of new people coming in the door, it can be really helpful to check references, to have that follow-up call and just learn a little bit more about their professional history, their board experience, their experience working on teams, that type of thing. Sometimes references can provide a lot of very, very beneficial context for candidates as you're going through this process. The other piece when we're thinking about engaging candidates is kind of the end of this process is onboarding your selected members. And I think that this is a really important piece of, the work does not end once we have selected a candidate, but really thinking, how are we bringing the new members on board? This is the last step of recruitment, but your first step in terms of board engagement and retention. So I've included some topics that are, typically covered during the onboarding of new members, My favorite one that I always highlight is the board buddy system. I think that this is a really fantastic tool. This is where you match up veteran board members with one of the incoming board members and make sure that that incoming board member always has that veteran member there to ask questions, to serve as a resource throughout meetings, to be able to do things like provide background, especially when new discussion points come up. Sometimes it's really helpful to have context around, has the organization dealt with this issue before? What has been the past conversation here? So board buddy can be really, really fantastic way of doing this. And especially if you have a board where you might have more formal, like if you're using Robert's Rules of Order or a similar type of structure for your decision and discussion process, that can be really alienating for folks if you have not experienced that before. So again, your board buddy can be a fantastic tool to help people engage in some of those newer processes and feel like they are welcome in that space rather than having to show up on the first day to their new board meeting and not having a lot of context for what's going on. So the last piece that I will share here before we move off into our final section is our second case study. And this came up, I think that this, I'm sure, LeeAnn, you have seen this in your world as well. I think this is really, really common, where the board might not have really been thinking about how are we recruiting new members, and you might not have a pipeline of members or potential options set up in terms of when you actually go into that recruitment process. So in this case, this is a grant-making organization. They were really, really struggling around recruiting new members. And a big reason for that was that the board, the nature of the work that they did meant that the board time commitment was incredibly high. There was a significant investment in time on the part of each board member. So usually they were pulling people into the board who had really deep connections to the organization already. And so it was a pretty small pool that they were working with there. And only one member of their board at this point was actually really thinking about recruitment. We had a champion, she was out there, she was doing excellent work, but she was kind of alone on an island, and she herself was going to retire in the next year. So it was at this moment that the board thought, you know what, we actually have to kind of revamp how we are doing this work. So the first thing that they did, they put in a recruitment committee. They had a rather large board, and they wanted to make sure that there was a good sense of responsibility. So we felt like, okay, let's get that committee in place so that they can be leading and making sure that their recruitment efforts are moving forward. Another key piece of what this group did was they helped to clearly define expectations for what is going to happen within the recruitment committee and what are the roles and responsibilities of all of the other board members within this work. Because they had a very disengaged board around recruitment, but guess what? If you don't actually tell people what you need them to do in clear and concise ways and give them tools to do that, it's not surprising that you're going to end up with a board that is a little bit confused about what they're supposed to be doing. So this recruitment committee really focused on how can we set our other teammates up for success in this process. The other thing that they did was they decided to implement another large board committee that was focused on a very specific task. They were basically reviewing a type of application on a quarterly basis. So it was a time-bound task. You come in, you review the pieces, you move forward. But what they did was they opened this committee up and invited a large number of non-board members into this work, because what they wanted to do was figure out how can we have folks who might be interested in working on our board, but who are not yet ready to fully commit to this. How can we give them a taste and a flavor of the work that we do? So they set up this committee. It included some board members, primarily non-board members, other stakeholders from the community, folks who are interested in the mission and the work that was happening, so that they could engage in kind of this lower stakes way that was still producing a really meaningful outcome for the organization. So this wasn't fluff work by any means. This was really important, but in terms of the time commitment and energy required, it was certainly smaller than a full board role. And making those two changes, they saw some pretty dramatic outcomes, I would say here. The first was that it was just much easier for all of the board members to be engaged in the recruitment process when they were given those talking points, when they were told this is specifically the actions that we're hoping each board member can take. by introducing that larger non-board member committee that also it was successful in what they were hoping for it to do, which was it created a better pipeline. It meant that there were people who are coming in and out of that committee experiencing, what does this work environment look like? Do I want to make that next commitment to actually be on the board? And it did make their next recruitment cycle significantly easier because they already had a pool of interested candidates. And the kind of other piece that I don't think anyone necessarily, it wasn't the primary purpose of this work, but in creating that larger committee, they also created a really fantastic way for other stakeholders within their community to get engaged with the organization, regardless of whether or not they were going to be a board member. This just opened up another opportunity, a really meaningful volunteer opportunity for folks to get engaged. So it was a really positive outcome from start to finish there. Okay, with that then, I think we have one more polling question before we get to our last section.
So here we are at poll number 3. What is the most challenging part in your board recruitment process? A, identifying the gaps. B, developing a strategy. C, time. D, finding candidates. E, evaluating and selecting. F, all over the place. G, I'm not sure. For those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts. We will also be sending the slides via email tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast.
How are we doing on that? Yeah, the response rate.
And here we go, the results.
Finding, yeah, all over the place.
I feel like on the last time I asked this question, that all over the place was even higher than this one. So exciting to see that there's some other pieces coming up here, but I'm not surprised to see finding candidates. How about you, LeeAnn?
I'm not. That's always the big one. Yeah. Leveraging those talking points and getting the word out there. That one's a big one. If you can take that one away and start pushing out recruitment to more and more people and simplifying it, I promise you that will pay it forward. So it's not the end all, but I promise you, if you make it simple for people, they will help you. All right, back over to you, anyways.
All right, well then I'm going to talk about succession planning. I know we only have a few minutes left here, so I'm going to keep us rolling through this section. But succession planning, when it comes to board succession planning, sometimes people think, this is just kind of replacing our board chair. We need to think about that. But we would encourage you to think about succession planning as a more overarching process of how are we developing the talent, systems, and strategies to ensure an organization can thrive when a leader leaves. So this isn't just about replacing one person, but think about how are we developing all of our board members? How are we developing that next kind of set of potential candidates as well? So in terms of succession plans, and when it comes to a board situation, we have here kind of the spectrum of if you can have a well-planned and communicated transition. I'm going to use again the example, if your board chair is leaving, and that can be a well-planned and communicated process, there's a lot of benefits that can come from that versus a poorly planned and communicated. I'm sure many of you have the experience of hearing just out of the blue an announcement that some major leader within the organization is heading out the door, and that can lead to a lot of questions. I think that the second line here, where you see on the one side, if you know in advance and can communicate out saying we're so excited, X, Y, and Z will be retiring at this date. We're going to be bringing on or opening up the recruitment process. If you can even say a statement as simple as that, that can really help the stakeholders, your partners, your organizational people who really care about your organization feel like, okay, this was planned, this was intentional, versus feeling like, ooh, I have a lot of questions about what's happening. Is this a sign that something is going wrong? Because a lot of times that's the thing that someone will read in between the lines if not given additional information. So just really want to stress that as much as you can, really be thoughtful about bringing new folks in and transitioning the folks out who are retiring off of the board, the better off you will be there. Another key thing that we have our 5 myths of succession planning here, but the first one I think is really important. A lot of times people think that succession planning is just for the CEO or for the management team within an organization. We strongly would encourage you to think about this for your board roles, in particular for your board officer roles. Who do we have within the board? If our treasurer left tomorrow, do we have someone else who can step in here? But also thinking generally, how are we building the pool for the board moving forward? Succession planning is just for people who are retiring who have given notice. This one is a great one. It's fantastic if you know when people are going to be retiring. It's fantastic if they've given you notice. Sometimes that just doesn't happen, and that can be for positive or negative reasons, but sometimes that is just the case. So one of the things that we always encourage is making sure that you have some elements of the succession plan set up in advance for all of the most critical members of your team. Succession planning is not just HR's job. In fact, when it comes to board work, it is almost always work that is really done and held at that board level. Succession planning, I've already talked about. This is not just about identifying a single replacement candidate. And sometimes we just don't think this is even relevant for our industry. It's really relevant. We all know that the show Succession is relevant for, big corporations where there's a lot of money flying around, but maybe not so much here. And I would say it is absolutely critical, especially if you're within a nonprofit or an organization that is resource constrained. You want to be using all of your resources as effectively as possible. So definitely this is something we see across all industries. Who needs a succession plan? Like I said, we have your executive director, your C-suite. I think a lot of folks are familiar with the concept of wanting a succession plan for those roles. But you will see here, we also have all of the other board officer roles here, as well as your committee chairs and truly all of your board members. We would, though, recommend if you don't have anything in place, start with your board chair, expand to your officer roles, and then think about your committee chairs. But you can definitely sequence this, phase this. You don't need to do it all at one time. When we think about a plan, I've said the word succession plan quite a lot. What do we actually mean by a plan document? Usually when we think about developing a plan, again, this is work that is often best supported by a smaller committee, especially if you're in a larger board. Having a nominations and governance committee or a similar group do this work and at least lead this work can be really helpful. Within a transition plan itself, the key pieces of information: timeline. Do we know when this person may or may not be leaving their role? Knowledge transfer. What are the critical areas of knowledge that they hold that are not held by others within the board? Relationships and partnership transfers. I think that one is super, super critical because oftentimes relationships are held at the board level. So we want to make sure that we're building in time to build those relationships before someone leaves the organization with others. Successor options, if you have them, as well as when are we actually going to communicate this out. All right. We are almost on the home stretch here. I have one more polling question for you, so I'm going to whip through these last few slides. We've talked about identifying potential candidates for the board in general. Another piece of this is identifying those internal potential successors. For example, who's going to be your next board chair? That is typically coming from within your group. Sometimes that is structured for you already. Your vice chair will become your chair or what have you. But sometimes, especially for roles like treasurer or others, that's less clear. So you want to think again, you can go back to that skills assessment. You can be thinking about, if we know our treasurer is leaving and we can identify somebody else within the board who's going to take that over, how can they mentor them over the course of the next year or so that they have on the board together? And then obviously, if you're looking externally, recommendations, networking, all of the things you'd be doing on the recruiting front as well. And then my very last piece here, succession planning pitfalls that we want to highlight for you. Not doing the planning work. Obviously, that's going to be a challenge. Lack of transparency. If you don't let people know how this process is actually working, they will fill in the blanks and they might have some nefarious answers. So you want to be as transparent and communicative as you can. Resistance to change from current board members. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Limited diversity or lack of experience in candidates. That's always a challenge for recruitment in general. Lack of engagement from that board committee. That can be another area. And then transition surprises. You can do all the planning work you want, but at the end of the day, somebody's going to throw a wrench in the work. That doesn't mean the plans go out the window. Usually a lot of it will still be relevant for you moving forward. So then with that, I know we have 2 minutes, so I'm going to skip over this last example that we have. This was a great board. They just did not want to transition out of their current roles. They were deeply committed. So this case study is just an example of what their executive director did to overcome that. We will be sharing these slides out after the session as well. But I want to get you to our final polling question here so that we can let you go on to the rest of your day. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Annie Rose. Here is our final poll of the day. How well do you think your current board is managing succession planning? A, very well. We have defined succession plans for most roles. B, okay, the board has some succession plans, but they are not formalized. C, not well. We need to put some best practices in place around succession planning. D, I'm not sure. Again, select that button right next to your answer and hit submit. That is showing up right in the slide view. Once you've completed all CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your certificate from the CPE progress window. I'll give everybody just a few more seconds to respond here. And the result.
Fantastic. Okay, this is great feedback too, sort of understanding where this group is at. It seems like there's a pretty wide range here. And we've seen a bunch of fantastic questions coming through in the chat here, and we are almost at time, so we won't be able to answer those live today, but we will do our best to follow up with each and every one of you. We so appreciate the engagement.
Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Annie Rose and LeeAnn, for a great presentation today. To our audience, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us, as we would love to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to Annie Rose and LeeAnn directly. Their contact information is in your console and up on the screen here. Also, I would like to draw attention to the image in the upper right-hand corner of your console. Click this to be taken to more information on our board governance series, and be sure to register for the next webcast, How to Create Inclusive Boards and Committees, which will be September 5th. Hopefully you can join us for that one as well. And if you met all CPE requirements, again, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any trouble downloading it now. And finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. Thank you for joining our webcast, and we hope you will join us again next time.